Hey everyone! So today's topic is about identifying arguments. So just as a quick review, we're sort of structured critical thinking around three main steps of argument analysis. The first is identifying an argument, which is our topic today. The second is reconstructing arguments. And then the third is evaluating arguments, which we have already talked about quite a bit. We've talked about validity. So that's when an argument's premises support its conclusion. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And then ways we can evaluate the premises themselves, rendering our argument sound, strong, or known. So we sort of started with step 3. And then today we're going to kind of go back and talk about step 1, identifying an argument. And then some of the things we'll talk about today will also be relevant for step 2, which is reconstructing an argument. And that'll be our next topic after we talk about identification, but step 2 will be for a later video. Okay, so I guess to think about this, I think it's really helpful to think about, well, what is our goal in this whole thing in general? Like, why do we want to engage in argument analysis? And I think this even is related to the question, what is the goal of critical thinking? So our goal is not to make ourselves look good or to prove someone wrong or to make someone else look bad. If you remember back from the very first video, we talked about the person of contradiction who just wants to believe the opposite of whatever they hear. That is not our goal in argument analysis. Our goal isn't just to affirm our previously held opinions. If we get a bunch of evidence against those opinions, then it's a good idea to lower our confidence in those or even at some point give them up. So remember the dogmatist, they would just try to look for evidence that confirmed everything they already believed. That's not what we want to do. And our goal also isn't to win a debate. And often winning a debate is done by making ourselves look good or making someone else look bad. So that's not our goal here. That's not what we're teaching you to do. What our goal is finding the truth. So we want to know the truth. And this could really be about anything. This could be about controversial topics. This could be about what assignments you have for a certain class. I mean, we can really use argument analysis in almost any domain. But our goal is to find the truth about a certain topic. And what's cool about this is we can apply it to almost any topic. So it's really useful, valuable for a lot of different areas of life. So we find the truth by following our evidence, by gathering new evidence, and then by looking at the evidence with an open mind. And that's really what we're trying to do in argument analysis is we're saying, okay, we're looking at this person's writing, this person's speech, and then we're saying, well, what do they want us to believe? And then what are their reasons for that? And then we evaluate the argument and say, well, are those actually good reasons? So that's really what we're trying to do in critical thinking is show you how to find the truth by following your evidence and then looking at new evidence you get with an open mind. Okay, so sort of keeping this in mind, I think this gives us really good reason to accept what is called the principle of charity. And let's say that we're looking at someone's argument, and that argument can be interpreted in multiple ways. If our goal of argument analysis was to win a debate or to make that person look bad, then it might be effective to interpret their argument as weakly as possible, or even sort of twist their words to make it sound like they're saying something that's maybe close to what they're saying, but not really what they're actually saying. And if you're trying to win a debate or make them look bad, these would be good strategies. But that's not our goal. Remember, our goal is to find the truth. And because this is our goal, when we're interpreting someone else's argument, we want to be as charitable as possible. So what does that mean? Basically, the principle of charity is this. When reconstructing someone else's argument, we should try to make that argument as strong as possible, but within the author's intentions, right? So we don't want to attribute to them an argument that they're not making, but sort of holding their intentions fixed, holding what they said fixed. We're going to try to make their argument as strong as possible. So what does as strong as possible mean? Well, this includes trying, consistent with their intentions, of course, to make the argument valid. So make their premises support their conclusion If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Remember, that's what validity means. And then also interpret them as giving premises that are reasonable to believe, or even better, known by them or their audience, or both. And again, we don't want to attribute to someone something that they didn't intend to say. But if we have someone that, gave a speech or a piece of writing that they wrote, and we're choosing between two plausible interpretations of what they mean, we should pick the one that is the stronger argument. And that's what the principle of charity is basically saying. And then doing this can help us look at their argument in the best light possible. And then we can say, have they given us a good reason to believe this conclusion, which helps us get at the truth? Again, we're not trying to make them look bad or win a debate. We're trying to really say, have they given us a good reason to believe this thing? And then if they have, that can help us get closer to the truth, because we now have additional reasons in favor of the conclusion that they were trying to argue for. Okay, so here's kind of our first main point, which is the principle of charity. When reconstructing an argument, try to make that argument as strong as possible. And this principle, I think, will come into play quite a bit when we're reconstructing arguments, but I also think it is relevant for identifying arguments as well. So that's why we're sort of talking about it first. And note, this is why we began with step 3 of argument analysis, which is evaluating arguments. So understanding what makes an argument a good one, what makes an argument a strong one, can help us be charitable when we're identifying and reconstructing arguments. And if we didn't know what validity was, or we didn't know, arguments should have premises that are true, reasonable to believe, or known, if we didn't sort of have those tools in our back pocket, then I think it would be a lot harder to identify and reconstruct arguments in a charitable way. And it would be harder for us to do that in a way that would help us get at the truth. So that's why we start with step 3, and then go to step 1 and then step 2. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about identifying arguments specifically. So argument identification, basically, we're going to talk about writing specifically, but this can also apply to other forms of, when someone's trying to convince you of something, whether that's like a speech or something else. So argument identification basically takes that writing or speech and asks the question, is this an argument at all? And there's some steps to argument identification. The first is you want to try to look for the author's conclusion. So you want to ask yourself, what is the statement that the author is trying to get me to believe? And then after you've identified that, ask yourself, does the author have premises? Does the author include statements that give me reason to believe the conclusion, or give me evidence for the conclusion? And if yes, it's probably an argument. And if no, it's probably not an argument. So those are our 2 steps of argument identification. Let's talk about some things that are not arguments. Descriptive writing isn't argumentative. Descriptive writing describes a person or an object or an event. So some news articles that just sort of say, here's a series of events that occurred. It's not really an argument. They're just sort of telling you something that happened. Another thing that's not an argument, but I think is a little bit trickier, is what's called rhetorical writing. And rhetorical writing asserts an author's opinion, but it doesn't offer premises. It doesn't offer reasons or evidence for that opinion. Rhetorical writing can be very forceful, very emotional. It can convince people, but it's not actually giving us arguments. So one example of this is the United States Declaration of Independence. This says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think many people take this to be a very powerful and a very convincing statement. I think people read this and then they're convinced, yeah, all men are created equal and they do have inalienable rights. But what's notable is that this passage, at least taken by itself, doesn't give us an argument for that. It just says this is a self-evident truth, and then it states some opinion. But it doesn't have premises, it doesn't have actual pieces of evidence for that conclusion. So this is rhetorical writing. It's an asserting someone's opinion, but doesn't offer reasons. So I think to kind of help us see the three types of writing, what I want to do is take one topic and then give an example of what writing about that topic would be for each of these types. So if you are writing about a bridge, here's something that might be descriptive writing. Work is underway to build a bridge over the river. The bridge will be 50 meters long and 20 meters high. So you might see this in like a news article about a town that's building a new bridge. It's not, there's not some kind of like controversial thing that the author's trying to convince you of. They're just sort of describing something. So this isn't an argument. They're just sort of telling you about this bridge building. Here's something that could be considered rhetorical writing. Clearly, we ought to build a bridge over the river. We should definitely limit the cars that go on it, and let's fix the park while we are at it. So, there's some clear opinions coming across, some strong language, clearly, definitely. But notice the author is just basically asserting their opinion. They're not giving you premises. They're not giving you reasons to believe their opinion. They're just asserting it in a kind of, maybe an intense way, but this doesn't contain an argument. Here's an example of our third type of writing, which is called argumentative writing. It says, we ought to build a bridge over the river because doing that is the best way to solve our traffic problems. So notice, we ought to build a bridge over the river. That's the conclusion. That's the thing the author who is speaking or writing here wants you to believe. And then they give a reason to support that conclusion. Doing so is the best way to solve our traffic problems. So we could even think about this in premise conclusion form. We should do the thing that best solves our traffic problems. Building a bridge over the river best solves our traffic problems. Therefore, we ought to build a bridge over the river. So hopefully it's clear why this third example is an argument. It gives us a reason to believe the author's conclusion. Rhetorical writing, the author had a lot of things that they wanted you to believe, but they didn't give us reasons or evidence for them. And then descriptive writing, it was just describing the bridge. So again, it's not an argument. Okay, so a little bit more about argumentative writing, this third kind of writing and the one that we're most interested in. Argumentative writing gives reasons or evidence to establish the truth of a particular claim. And note that in some cases, it might be weak evidence. It might be reasons or evidence that aren't very good and shouldn't make you very confident in whatever claim they're trying to establish. And I think one kind of interesting question is, when is something just a really weak argument and when is it not an argument at all? I think that's a question that's worth exploring more. And I think maybe the best way to answer that would be to say, well, is there some kind of reason or some kind of evidence, even if it's weak, or is there no reason or evidence at all? But I do think it's worth thinking more about weak arguments versus non-arguments. It's also worth noting that a long piece of text or a speech might contain all three of these kinds of writing and potentially even more. It probably has some description, some rhetoric, and then some of it is actually giving arguments for the author's conclusion. And our goal, what we want to do is zero in on the argument or arguments and then ignore the other stuff. So we want to look at the conclusion and then look at the premises, which are reasons or evidence to support that conclusion. And then try to not pay attention to things that aren't relevant, especially, if it's just some kind of rhetorical thing, but there's no reason or evidence for it. That isn't helping us with our goal of getting at the truth. To get at the truth, we need to look at the reasons and the evidence. So that's why we zero in on the argument or arguments. Zeroing in on the argument like this, though, it's not always easy. And sometimes argumentative writing is in there, but it's hidden by descriptions. And I think even more tricky when it's hidden by rhetoric, because both argumentative writing and rhetorical writing are trying to convince you of something, and often that thing is controversial, but we really need to see, is this something that gives us reasons or evidence or not? So like I said, it can be especially difficult to identify the difference between rhetorical and argumentative writing. And if you're struggling, let's go back to our steps, right? What is the author's conclusion? What is the author trying to get us to believe? And then is there actual reasons or evidence for it? Or are they just sort of asserting their conclusion in maybe a really convincing way, maybe they're using really strong language, but try to really filter that out and ask yourself, what are the reasons, what are the evidence that they're giving? Okay, so what we have covered today. We've talked about the goal of argument analysis, which is to get at the truth. And then we've discussed the principle of charity, which is that when we're looking at other people's arguments, trying to identify them and trying to reconstruct them, we want to make their arguments as strong as possible, but in a way that's consistent with the author's intentions. Then we've discussed the 2 steps of argument identification. Step 1 is looking for the author's conclusion. And then step 2 is looking for reasons or evidence that support that conclusion. And then we've talked about the 3 kinds of writing: descriptive, rhetorical, and argumentative. And argumentative is the one we're going to want to focus on because that is the one that helps us best meet our goal of getting at the truth. Much of the content from this was taken from Feldman's Reason and Argument, Chapter 5.